Greetings to everyone. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is Comparative Politics, an analysis of the modern approaches. In this lecture, we shall attempt to understand modern approaches in the subject of comparative political analysis. This lecture shall elaborate on the sociological, economic, quantitative, psychological, systems approach, behavioral approach, simulation approach while discussing the topic of modern approaches in comparative politics. This lecture shall also analyze the advantages and disadvantages of the modern approaches in comparative research with reference to the use of traditional approaches. To begin with, how do we understand comparative politics? Comparative politics, if we go by the popular online Google research that we did for you, we found the reference that it is the comparative study and comparison of diverse political systems of the world. To quote the perspective of M.G. Smith, who described that comparative politics is the study of forms of political organizations, their properties, correlations, variations, and modes of change. We all know that any discipline involves various approaches to understand it, to facilitate research. While we understand the subject of comparative political analysis, the traditional approaches, namely the legal approach, the philosophical approach, the historical approach, amongst others, focused on the study of political apparatus, focused on the formal study of institutions. The analysis involved looking at similarities and dissimilarities, analyzing advantages and disadvantages of various types of political institutions. Now, within the domain of traditional approaches in comparative politics, an important point of criticism has been the narrow focus, the normative perspective, and mostly reliance on descriptive techniques of research. In the similar vein, the modern approaches in the subject of comparative analysis involve the use of empirical data over mere description. The focus as compared to traditional approaches is indeed broad, where the focus is just not on analyzing similarities and dissimilarities of the political structures and looking at the historical and philosophical aspects, but looking at it from an interdisciplinary perspective, which also includes a reliance on scientific methods of study. Let's take the lecture forward as we look at the modern approaches. The sociological approach. Now, sociology, if we are to understand, we all know it's a very important discipline. If we quote the definition of Kingsley Davis, who said that sociology is a general science of society. Auguste Comete also focused on the science of society, looking at the natural and the invariable laws, the discovery which is the object of investigation. Sociology, as we all know, is an important discipline, and this discipline definitely has a bearing on the study of comparative politics. When we study culture, when we study political behavior, indeed all of it has a bearing with reference to sociological inputs. Harry M. Johnson defined sociology as sociology is the science that deals with social groups. Now, this definition by Harry M. Johnson, that is, sociology dealing with social groups, indeed presents to us very important insights for the sociological approach, that how sociological approach can be of use in the study of comparative political analysis, looking at the legislative aspects, looking at how culture has a bearing on various other inputs. Sociological approach is very useful with reference to analysis of attitudes, beliefs, emotions, values of the society studied from the various sociological perspectives. As we all know, that sociology as a discipline involves certain very significant aspect, and an important aspect, if we are to quote Emile Durkheim, the famous sociologist, who held that sociology is the science of social institutions. So therefore, with reference to analysis of political behavior, looking at political institutions, studying the entire framework of political norms, values, then becomes very important to be seen within the sociological inputs, to be seen within the framework of tools that we get from the discipline of sociology. Moving forward, sociology is again very important when we look at the state and society. State and society studies, they focus on the interactions, interdependency between the formal apparatus of the state and the informal processes going on in the societal realm. So therefore, sociological approach as a modern approach investigates on political relations, political institutions from a bigger canvas. It gives us important insights to understand the link between behaviors, patterns, norms, social conditions, amongst others. Further, it also highlights the important interdependence, namely with respect to political science, comparative analysis, formal institutions, and seen in the bigger framework of sociology. Another important modern approach is the psychological approach. Now, as we are to understand psychology as a discipline, a very important perspective by Wilhelm Wundt pointed out that psychology is the science which deals with internal experiences. It studies the internal experiences. Another important perspective on psychology comes from Sully, who defined psychology as the science of the inner world, as distinguished from the physical science, which deal with primarily the physical phenomena. Now, seen in this light, when we look at psychology, then becomes very important. For example, when we are studying the citizen behavior with respect to a policy, when we are analyzing the attitudes and preferences of the voter, when we are looking at the issues that go in a legislation from the point of view of legislator. So therefore, psychological perspective, it becomes very important while we understand power politics. We all know from national to the global level, power politics has indeed played an important role. And to have a better understanding of power politics, psychological approach becomes very important. Further, we all know the utilitarian perspective, the utilitarian approach, which accesses an action in terms of the consequences of outcomes, namely maximization of happiness, of pleasure. So therein also, when we try to understand political relations, when we try to decipher political behavior, psychology is linked to the bigger aspect of political activity. Further, when we are trying to understand the mission, the mandate, the objectives of any policy, psychology further has an important bearing. So therefore, as a modern approach, the psychological approach definitely gives more inputs to analyze the political phenomena, to look at the political process from a bigger framework. Next modern approach that we must discuss is the economic approach. Now, as we try to understand economics as a discipline, let us present you some very important perspectives and definitions of important authors on economics. Lionel Robbins said, economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. An important perspective on economics comes from George Bernard Shaw, who held that economy is the art of making most of life. Another important perspective comes from Alfred Marshall, who held that economics is the study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. So, seen in this perspective, when we look at fiscal policy, when we look at industrial policies between two countries, when we try to look at economic issues between two countries, economic approach indeed becomes very important when we try to understand interest group politics within a particular political framework. Economic approach further gives important inputs. We've also known that how the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, with the focus towards the base superstructure, historical materialism, trying to analyze any phenomena from the perspective of class struggle, from the perspective of therein also economic approach played an important role. So when we try to understand the economic approach to assist looking at similarities and issues of divergences between two countries with respect to their fiscal policies, agricultural issues, global governance issues, global firms issues, economic approach indeed becomes very important. As we are discussing modern approaches, another important modern approach is the quantitative approach. Now, as we discuss the quantitative approach, it becomes essential that we differentiate it from the qualitative approach. Now, qualitative approach or the research focuses on the non-numeric part, that is the qualitative aspects focuses on the normative and the descriptive component of research. In contrast to that, the quantitative research focuses on the numeric data, that is information that can be quantified, that can be measured, that can be counted. Now, when we talk about quantitative approach as a modern approach, it is often known as the statistical approach. There is reliance on the use of numerical data and the important focus towards, namely, proving the scientific validity of a proposition, proving an argument in terms of its scientific and validation in terms of the numeric content is an important aspect of the quantitative approach. Now, as we are discussing the quantitative approach, we must understand that how, with the addition of statistical tools, with the addition of numeric data, the quantitative approach indeed presents some very important inputs for the purpose of research methodology, as well as enabling us to look at comparative political analysis in a bigger framework. When we are talking about modern approaches, an important modern approach has been the systems approach. Now, when we talk about systems approach, dear learners, the work of Karl Ludwig von Bertalanffy, the Austrian biologist who used the systems approach for the study of biology, namely looking at the interdisciplinary study that describes systems with interacting components. So therefore, when we understand the systems approach, the main analysis focus of the systems approach, and that is the relationship of political life with other aspects of the social life. Now, as we are understanding the systems approach, this work of the systems approach was later used extensively by Talcott Parsons. Talcott Parsons, the American sociologist known for his social action theory and his work on structural functionalism. Talcott Parsons promoted the concept of social system, that is, social system as a network of interactions between actors, and social system that is a subsystem of the action theory. David Easton developed the concept of political system in the same light. So therefore, as we understand the systems approach from the work of David Easton, the political system approach operates within an environment. The environment produces demands from different parts of society. Different demands have different levels of support. Through the conversion process, the inputs are converted into outputs by the decision maker in the form of policies, rules, regulations, laws. The output flow back to the environment through a feedback mechanism, giving rise to fresh demands. So therefore it works like a recurring process. Authoritative allocation of values with threat or actual use of deprivations to make them binding and all has been an important perspective with reference to the political system. So therefore the features of political system that we can take from the work of David Easton, that are openness, adaptiveness, comprehensive, self-regulating, ongoing. It is composed of a number of structures which have specific functions. An important perspective when we try to understand the systems approach and the modern approach, it is that of behavioralism. Let us understand what is behavioralism. Behavioralism stresses on the scientific, objective and value-free study of the political occurrences. It is conditioned by the environment. Firmly, the behavior of the individuals involved in that phenomena is carefully analyzed. David Easton opined, and we present his perspective here, that is, behavioral revolution is an intellectual tendency on part of the political scientists to study the empirical political behavior of persons. When we try to understand behavioralism, we must look at certain important features of behavioralism, namely consequences, that is, looking at the consistencies in political behavior which can be expressed in terms of generalizations, use of research methodology which generates valid comparative data, looking at objectivity, namely separation of facts from values. So behavioralism, it is essential to point out, it is different from behaviorism. Behaviorism, it is a narrow term. Its application is narrow, namely looking at responses to a stimulus. Behavioralism, on the other hand, incorporates the role of ideas, the feeling, the emotive aspect, looking at the bigger picture of the studying the individual in a bigger subset, in a bigger context of the system, and above all employing a scientific perspective input to study the social phenomena. As we are discussing the modern approaches, an important modern approach is the simulation approach. Now, simulation, if we go by the definitions presented from the discipline of management, it is the study with the help of image construction and modern building. An example of simulation approach could be the decision-making approach. The work of Richard Zinder and Charles Lindblom are very important when we try to understand the simulation approach. Karl Ludwig pointed out that how one part of the system affects another by sending messages or transformating of information. So all these inputs become very important while understanding the simulation approach. Now we just saw all the modern approaches. Now as we understand the modern approaches, one of the definite advantages of the modern approaches try to make the study of political science the subject of comparative political analysis in a very big framework. They attempt to situate the study closer to everyday reality, namely linking it to disciplines like sociology, psychology, economics, amongst others. By getting the focus towards empirical data, new inputs, looking at the bigger framework of the phenomena of systems, the modern approaches definitely attempt to make the study of comparative political analysis more relevant with new insights. However, there are certain drawbacks also. That is, it is indeed when we try to discuss the disadvantages of the modern approaches, it is difficult task to study norms, to study ideas, to study various perspectives. So therefore, the subjectivity aspect cannot be ignored. Further, many political concepts are immeasurable too. That is a bigger challenge in the use of modern approaches. And this is why, as we are discussing the modern approaches, this is why the post-behavioralists, like a reform movement within the behavioralism, try to present a new perspective. So the study of modern approaches indeed presents new inputs, new insights to the study of comparative political analysis. However, at the same time, looking at issues in data collection, issues of subjectivity of political concepts, amongst others, cannot be ignored also as important challenges confronting the use of modern approaches in the subject and discipline of comparative political analysis. We hope that the lecture presented important inputs and insights to all our viewers, to all our learners on the subject of modern approaches in comparative political analysis. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.